The US wants to dissolve the G7, and they want to create something called the Core 5, C5. C5 would be, according to the Trump administration, United States, Russia, China, India, and Japan. What is that? Blowing up bricks from the inside. Simple as that. They would like to create a mechanism, a C5, that will be more important than bricks, even though it contains 3 bricks. So while you create C5, and you have the US and Japan side by side, containing China, you try to isolate Russia from China, and you try, of course, to provoke splits between Russia and India and China. So it's, as you can all see, it's not a very clever strategy. But this is all that the Americans have at the moment. The Trump administration has at the moment. What makes this dangerous isn't the idea itself, it's the desperation behind it. When a system can't compete economically, it tries to rearrange power politically. But blocks built on manipulation don't hold. They fracture. The moment incentives change, and in a multipolar world, incentives are changing faster than Washington can control. It's a sequence of divide and rules. Once again, the hybrid war against BRICS continues, but now is on another level. And it's okay. We're going to split them from the inside and going to try to get one to clash against the other. Very, very dangerous, to say the least. The danger is simple. Divide and rule only works in a unipolar world. In a multipolar one, it does the opposite. It hardens alliances instead of breaking them. They're simply stabbing. Ukrainians stabbing, Europeans in the back. The no European country is in that. Exactly. Is that? But they will continue, Nema. Because, we have been talking about this for ages. There's no plan B. When I arrived in Italy 10 days ago or so, the big news everywhere in Italy was the admiral, which he is, I think, the number 2 at NATO drone, who said that we are starting to consider the possibility of a preemptive attack against Russia. Everybody was, of course, not mainstream media in Italy, but all the progressive circles everywhere, informed people, academics, top scholars, they were talking about that, they say. And now these idiots, and even in Italian, they want to plunge us into total war. It's completely nuts, So when the Americans look at that, they don't care. And this is I would say, if this was a fable, the moral of the fable, in the end, would be, we don't care what you Europeans do. We already moved on. And the national security strategy proves that they already moved on. This is the real fracture. Decisions are being made in Washington, while the consequences land in Europe. When strategy moves on, but allies are left holding the risk, partnership turns into liability. And that's how trust collapses, because the priorities are Western Hemisphere, Latin America, and Indo-Pacific, which doesn't exist. It's Asia-Pacific, meaning this is a shorthand for containing China. These are the priorities, and of course normalizing with Russia, but normalizing up to a point. That's it. Europe? What is Europe? They don't care. Coming back to the beginning of our conversation, You know, if Europe will change its destiny, it will have to be via a grassroots movement, and probably coming from Italy, because Italy has all the political, cultural, geo-economic, geopolitical, accumulated history over 2,000 years to pull it off. It is the most civilized place in the West. No competition. This says everything about the moment we're in. Europe is no longer a priority. It's a variable. When great powers shift focus, regions don't get rescued from above. They change course from below, or they don't change at all. They are against European citizens, and especially citizens of nation-states. Brussels is against the average Italian, buying his grocery and buying his absolutely outstanding groceries every day. That's it against people who live in small villages, self-sustain, practice self-sustainable agriculture, that kind of thing. It's an absolutely failed artificial construct that is now imploding in slow motion. But it's still going to take a long time for it to totally collapse. And that's the core disconnect. When governance turns hostile to everyday life, local culture, small economies, self-sufficiency, it loses moral authority. Systems like that don't collapse from rebellion. They erode quietly until there's nothing left to defend. There are a lot of discussions about Brexit-style exits from the European Union, which is something that could happen, I would say, in 4 or 5 years, certainly. But the most important problem, from the point of view of everyday life, is that this implosion is accompanied by, more taxes everywhere, more and more, disappearance of public services, more concentration of wells, for instance, the 1% in Europe. They live unimaginable wells, unto the whole global south, in fact. When you drive in, it's amazing. We crossed Chianti and Val d'Orche, going to Montal, China, which is the holy grail of wine. Of course, I go there every time I come to Italy. And my friends were telling me, do you see all these spectacular 5-6 million villas here? They are not owned by Italians anymore. They are owned by Anglo-Americans. They are owned especially by Brits and Americans, and people who work in the financial markets, investment funds, hedge funds. And was fascinating. We were having an amazing lunch in Montalcino, drinking the best Brunello, and I was paying attention to the conversation on the table by our side. Guess what was happening? An American buying a villa from an Italian woman, and I think they clinched the deal by the end of the meal. She was desperate to sell because was broke. The only thing left for her and her family was the villa. And then, you see this American. He looked shabby. He didn't even look like a New York investment banker. He looked shabby, but he had the cash. So he could buy a villa that he would never understand the meaning of that villa. Probably a villa coming from the 13th or 14th century. You know, with their own winery and all that. But he had the cash to buy it. Horrible. 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 This is what decline actually looks like. Not tanks in the streets, but heritage sold under pressure. When taxes rise, services vanish, and wealth concentrates. People don't lose ideology first. They lose land, culture, and dignity. By the time exits are debated, the damage is already done. Do you think that the power within Europe is somehow changing from the West to the East, or something is happening in Europe? I'm not sure about that. What is your understanding? Oh, was broke. The only thing left for her and her family was the villa. And then, you see this American, he looked shabby. He didn't even look like a New York investment banker. He looked shabby, but he had the cash. So he could buy a villa that he would never understand the meaning of that villa. Probably a villa coming from the 13th or 14th century, with their own winery and all that. But he had the cash to buy it. Horrible, horrible, horrible is what decline actually looks like. Not tanks in the streets, but heritage sold under pressure. When taxes rise, services vanish, and wealth concentrates, people don't lose ideology first. They lose land, culture, and dignity. By the time exits are debated, the damage is already done. Do you think that the power within Europe is somehow changing from the West to the East, or something is happening in Europe? I'm not sure about that. What is your understanding, okay. There are two vectors. Let's say there is a vector that is you. Going style. That will be Hungary, Slovakia, few others. But there's also a vector that is trying to transfer power within the EU especially towards an axis, comprising Poland. Land. Very complicated story, because they have an inferiority complex, a tremendous inferiority complex, and at the same time, arrogance. They still believe that they are in their own empire in the 17th century, and the Baltic Shihu, the original plan for the new NATO before the SMO, and even assuming that they would be able to destroy the Russian economy in 6 months, which was their original plan, is that the new NATO would be basically guided by the Axis, London, a Warsaw, a Baltic Shihu, Polak Shihu, and Kyiv. So obviously, this plan completely collapsed. What he's really describing is confusion, not transition. Europe isn't shifting power eastward. It's arguing over who gets to pretend that they're in charge. When strategies are built on fantasy, imagined empires, and overestimated leverage, collapse isn't a surprise. It's the expected outcome. So they are trying to get Romania into this bunch. And at the same time, we have the anti-Brussels group, which can become much, much stronger. And we have the disintegration of the three most important members, Germany, France, and Italy. Italy once again will depend on the Italians getting their act together. Progressive Italians, it's a long shot. France, the country, is totally broken. Libertio, the actual popularity rate, is even less than 10%. It's probably around 5%. If it gets to 5%, everybody hates but they cannot get rid of him because an impeachment process in France is totally impossible because the system blocks it. And taxes are going off the roof. People are desperate because they cannot pay their bills anymore. Even middle-class French men and women cannot pay their bills anymore. That this went totally downhill. With Liberty and Germany, with this Black Rock chancellor. It's once again his popularity rate is the worst of any chancellor in recent memory in his first year. So the disintegration in the top three of the EU is blatant for everyone to see. And at the same time, there is this sentiment of impotence. Nothing can be done about it. Why? Because there's no political articulation coming from the grassroots. Something that has to start, and it has to mobilize young people in Italy. There are already good signs, young people being mobilized, especially against the genocide in Gaza, against NATO's wars. That's a start, already in France and in Germany. Forget it. The Germans are too passive to start anything. What we're watching isn't reform, it's paralysis. When the core states fracture and grassroots politics fail to organize, power doesn't transfer. It stagnates. And stagnation is dangerous than open collapse. Because nothing corrects course until the system finally gives way. You know, minimally revolutionary. So that's the problem. It points to a slow, painful, toxic process of disintegration on both institutions, on the EU and on NATO, and in parallel, and involving many of the key actors in all of them. But the main thing would be to try to discredit completely the Brussels system, and that is something that is approaching, because when we have a definitive Russian victory in Ukraine, where everybody's going to have to sit down on the table to listen and sign on the Russian demands, we were getting to this point in time sooner or later. Then the defeat of the collective West will be flagrant, total, graphic, crystal clear. You know, any way you want to. And that will be the beginning of the end, of this dissolving, and this fragmentation, this collapse of both the EU and NATO. So the key, if we had to set a timeline and a key date, Nemo would be the day when Russia will tell the collective West, that's it, we won the war, and these are our conditions. There's no other way. If this plays out as he predicts, the collapse won't come from protest or reform, but from exposure. When outcomes finally contradict the narratives holding institutions together, legitimacy evaporates fast. EU and NATO wouldn't fall because they were attacked.